The year was 1909, and Detroit was a sprawling factory town drunk on the promise of the horseless carriage. It was a city of smoke and ambition, where inventors slept in their workshops and machinists earned more than doctors. The automobile was not a novelty anymore. It was an industry. On every block, some dreamer with a wrench and a patent was trying to be the next Henry Ford. Most would fail by Christmas. But on February 20th, 1909, 8 businessmen walked into the office of a man who had never learned to drive, who had no interest in combustion engines, and who made his fortune selling fabric and shoes. His name was Joseph Lowthian Hudson. He was 62 years old. He owned the second largest department store in the United States. And the men who walked through his door were about to convince him to fund an automobile company that would bear his name, revolutionize engineering, dominate the racetrack, and die because it was too good to change. This is the story of the Hudson Motor Car Company. It is the story of a merchant who never believed in cars, an engineer who proved they could be perfect, and a machine so revolutionary that its own brilliance became a cage. The empire that rose from a handshake between a skeptic and a dreamer would last exactly 48 years, and every single one of those years was borrowed time. Before we trace Hudson's rise from a cramped factory on Mack Avenue to the NASCAR tracks where it humiliated Detroit's giants, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below. And if you're fascinated by America's forgotten industrial empires, subscribe so you don't miss our next investigation into the companies that shaped a nation and then vanished. Now, let's meet the man who made it all possible. Joseph Lowthian Hudson was 62 years old in 1909, and he had never learned to drive. He didn't design cars. He didn't build factories. He didn't understand combustion engines or crankshafts or the difference between a touring car and a roadster. But he understood debt. He understood what it meant to fail, to lose everything, and to spend years clawing back your reputation $1 at a time. He was born in Newcastle-on-Tyne, England, in 1846. His family immigrated to Canada when he was 9, then drifted south into Michigan. By the time he was a young man, he was working in retail, learning the rhythm of inventory and customer trust. In the 1870s, he and his father opened a general store in Ionia, Michigan, a lumber town where the sawmills ran day and night, and the workers had money to spend. Then the panic of 1873 hit. The mills shut down. The credit dried up. The customers stopped paying. Hudson's father died. 3 years later, Joseph Hudson filed for bankruptcy. He paid his creditors 60 cents on the dollar. It was the standard arrangement. It was legal. It was also a failure that would haunt him. Hudson dusted himself off and moved to Detroit. In 1881, he opened a men's clothing store on the ground floor of the old Detroit Opera House. It was a modest operation. It sold suits. It sold shoes. It sold the kind of dependable merchandise that built quiet fortunes. But Hudson had a gift. He understood that retail was not about fabric. It was about trust. Customers returned because they believed the price was fair and the product was honest. By 1888, 7 years into his Detroit operation, Hudson had done something almost no one did. He tracked down every single creditor from the Ionia bankruptcy, the people he had paid 60 cents on the dollar over a decade earlier, and he paid them the remaining 40 cents, with compound interest. The gesture cost him $265,000. It was a fortune, but it was also a message. Joseph Hudson repaid his debts. The story spread through Detroit's business community. When Hudson spoke, bankers listened. When he vouched for someone, deals closed. His word was currency. In 1891, he opened a massive department store at the corner of Farmer Street and Gratiot Avenue. People thought he was insane. The location was too far north of the commercial district. The building was too big. The investment was too aggressive. But Hudson had calculated the risk. He knew Detroit was growing. He knew the automobile plants were hiring. He knew workers needed somewhere to spend their wages. The store succeeded beyond prediction. It expanded. It added floors. It hired thousands. By 1909, Hudson's department store was the second largest in the United States, exceeded only by Macy's in New York. The building measured over 2 million square feet. It rose 410 feet into the Detroit sky, the tallest department store in the world. It had 32 floors, 12,000 employees, and sales that would eventually reach $163 million a year. The store had its own post office. It had restaurants that served thousands of meals daily. It had a circulating library. Joseph Hudson had built an empire on the simple promise that he would sell you quality, and he would honor his word. He never married. He had no children. He was engaged to a woman named Ida Caroline Schmidt. But he would die before they could wed. His life was the store. His legacy was his name. And in February 1909, that name was about to be attached to something he didn't believe in. When 8 Detroit businessmen walked into his office with a proposal about horseless carriages, Hudson's first instinct was to show them the door. They were selling machines. He sold suits. But the man who led the pitch was Roy Dyckman Chapin, and Chapin was a salesman too. He understood that you don't sell a product, you sell a solution, and the solution he was selling was credibility. Chapin was born in Lansing, Michigan in 1880. He was 29 years old, lean and confident, with the kind of energy that made older men nervous. He had left the University of Michigan in 1901 to take a job at Olds Motor Works for $35 a month. His first assignment was to photograph inventory and file mechanical parts, but his talent was noticed. Within months, Ransom Olds himself asked Chapin to drive one of the company's curved-dash Oldsmobiles from Detroit to New York City for the second annual auto show. It was 1901. There were no paved highways. There were no gas stations. There were 820 miles of rutted dirt roads, canal towpaths, and whatever else a car could survive. Chapin departed Detroit and immediately ran into problems. On a narrow road outside the city, a farmer's hay wagon blocked his path. The horses balked at the sound of the engine. The farmer cursed. Chapin tried to churn through an open field and broke the suspension. He limped to a repair shop, lost a day, and kept driving. He navigated by asking directions from farmers. He forded streams where bridges had washed out. He drove at night when the roads were too hot during the day. It took him 7 days. He arrived in New York, filthy, exhausted, and victorious. The telegram he sent back to Detroit was brief. Arrived here at 11 in good order. The publicity was enormous. Newspapers ran stories about the daring young man who had conquered the distance between 2 great cities in an automobile. The curved-dash Oldsmobile became a sensation, and Roy Chapin became the face of the automobile as adventure. He had proven something fundamental. Cars were not toys. They were the future. By 1909, Chapin had left Olds and helped launch another car company, Thomas Detroit, which became Chalmers Detroit. He had watched Henry Ford bet everything on the Model T and win. He had seen luxury brands like Packard and Peerless succeed by charging thousands of dollars for elegance. And he saw a gap. The market had cheap cars for farmers and expensive cars for bankers. It didn't have much for the people in between, the upper middle class, the factory supervisors, the store managers, the people who made $40 a week and wanted something better than a Ford, but couldn't afford a Cadillac. Chapin pitched Hudson on a car that would sell for less than $1,000, but would feature the kind of engineering usually reserved for higher-priced models. He brought diagrams. He brought cost projections. He brought letters of intent from dealers. And he brought 7 other businessmen, including Howard Coffin, a brilliant engineer who had also worked at Olds, and George Dunham, a production specialist. The 8 of them needed $200,000 in capital. They needed a name that meant something. They needed someone Detroit trusted. Hudson listened. He asked questions about production costs, profit margins, and the competitive landscape. He was not interested in running a car company. He had a department store to manage. But he understood the pitch. These men were not asking him to build cars. They were asking him to lend his reputation. If the company succeeded, he would profit. If it failed, his name would still be attached to retail, not wreckage. The risk was acceptable. On February 20th, 1909, Hudson signed the agreement. He gave them $200,000. He gave them permission to name the company after him, and he extracted one condition: they would handle everything. He would provide capital and credibility. In exchange, they promised never to ask him to drive one. Across town, at the corner of Mack Avenue and Beaufait Street, stood the answer to their factory problem. The building was a ghost. It had been erected in 1905 by Alexander Malcolmson, a successful Detroit coal dealer who had been one of the original investors in the Ford Motor Company. Malcolmson and Henry Ford had clashed over strategy. Ford wanted to build cheap cars for the masses. Malcolmson believed the real money was in luxury vehicles, six-cylinder machines for wealthy buyers who appreciated craftsmanship and performance. When Ford won the argument and forced Malcolmson out of the partnership, Malcolmson decided to prove Ford wrong. He built his own factory right across Mack Avenue from Ford's plant and started a company called Aerocar. The location was deliberate. It was a challenge. The cars were beautiful. They were expensive. They were well-engineered. They were also a commercial disaster. By 1907, Aerocar was bankrupt. The factory sat empty. Malcolmson sold the building to pay his debts and retreated from the automobile business. The structure was 400 feet long and 54 feet wide. A mill-style brick building with high ceilings and railroad access along the Michigan Central Beltline. The Beltline ran down the center of the block, allowing freight cars to deliver raw materials and carry finished products directly to the docks or to other rail connections. It was exactly what Chapin needed. Hudson Motor Car Company bought the Aerocar building and moved in immediately. 500 workers were hired from Detroit's deep pool of skilled labor. Tools were installed. Assembly benches were organized. Machinery arrived on flatbed rail cars. And on July 3, 1909, just 4 months and 2 weeks after the company was incorporated, the first Hudson automobile rolled out of the factory that had been built to compete with Henry Ford. The car was called the Hudson 20. It was a 4-cylinder roadster with a sliding gear transmission, the kind of feature usually found on Packard or Pierce Arrow. The engine was small but smooth. The body was simple but well-proportioned. It sold for $900. It was handsome. It was reliable. It was immediately accessible to the middle-class buyers Chapin had identified. Dealers placed orders. Customers lined up. By the end of 1910, Hudson had sold 4,508 cars. It was the highest first-year production total in the history of the automobile industry. The company that had started in a ghost factory had jumped to 17th place in national sales rankings, at a time when there were hundreds of manufacturers competing for attention. The achievement was remarkable. It attracted notice, and it created an immediate problem. The Aerocar building was already too small. Chapin had a new location in mind before the paint dried on the first Hudson. He wanted land. He wanted space to expand. He wanted to build an industrial fortress that could manufacture tens of thousands of cars a year. He found 22 acres at the intersection of Jefferson Avenue and Conner Avenue in Detroit's Fairview section. The land had been a farm owned by a man named D.J. Campeau. It was diagonally across the street from the Chalmers automobile plant. It had direct access to rail lines. It sat along Conner Creek, a buried river that still flowed beneath the streets in a sewer channel. The creek had once powered grist mills in the 1800s. Now it was covered over, invisible. But the avenue that bore its name curved through Detroit's grid to trace the old waterway. The parcel cost $48,400. Chapin broke ground in early May 1910. He hired Albert Kahn, the architect who was transforming Detroit's industrial landscape with reinforced concrete factories that could support heavy machinery and vast open floors. Kahn's designs were revolutionary. Instead of multi-story brick buildings with wood floors that sagged and creaked, Kahn built single-story structures with concrete frames and glass walls that flooded the workspace with natural light. The construction cost $500,000. The result was a cathedral of manufacturing. The Jefferson Avenue plant was not a factory. It was a city dedicated to a single purpose. The main assembly building rose in stories of glass and concrete. It was designed for flow, for efficiency, for the relentless rhythm of production. Workers stood at stations as chassis moved down the line. Parts arrived from suppliers on rail cars, were unloaded at one end of the building, and emerged as finished automobiles at the other end. Kahn's architecture was famously robust. The frame was overbuilt. The concrete was thick. The columns were spaced to allow maximum flexibility for future equipment changes. Decades later, when the plant was finally scheduled for demolition in the 1950s, contractors discovered that Kahn had built it so well that the concrete and steel refused to surrender easily. Several companies reportedly went bankrupt attempting to level the structure. It took years to tear down what had taken months to build. By 1912, the Jefferson Avenue complex was fully operational. It would eventually expand to include a body plant at Gratiot and Connor. Designed by Kahn with the same reinforced concrete philosophy. An axle plant rose at East Verner and Connor. Stockyards appeared next to the Bud Wheel plant at Charlevoix. The entire empire stretched along Connor Avenue, following the path of the buried creek. At peak production in the late 1920s, the complex employed tens of thousands of workers. It manufactured 300,000 vehicles a year. Hudson had a reputation as a more family-friendly environment than some of Detroit's other plants. The company employed women in significant numbers, unusual for the era. Women worked in light assembly, building instrument panels and wiring harnesses. They soldered connections. They installed upholstery. They worked on the final assembly line, checking quality and making adjustments. The factory was loud and hot and exhausting, but it paid better than retail or domestic work, and it was building cars that people wanted. The factory could build cars. That was settled. But Chapin wanted to build cars that no one had seen before. By 1913, Hudson was building its own engines, but Chapin wasn't satisfied with what was coming out of the block. Most manufacturers were using four-cylinder engines. They were adequate. They were cheap, but they vibrated. They were rough at idle. They struggled on hills. The pistons fired unevenly. The whole chassis shook. Chapin and Howard Coffin, the company's chief engineer, wanted something better. They wanted an engine that delivered power smoothly, that could rev high without shaking the chassis apart, that would make a Hudson feel like a more expensive car. Coffin designed the Super 6. It was a straight six-cylinder engine with a balanced crankshaft. The innovation was in the crankshaft itself. Most engines at the time used crankshafts that were functional but unbalanced. As the pistons fired in sequence, the forces were irregular. The engine shook. Coffin's design balanced the reciprocating forces. The counterweights were precisely calculated. The result was an engine that idled like silk and accelerated like a predator. When the Super 6 debuted in 1916, it was a revelation. The engine could reach speeds that four-cylinder cars couldn't touch. It could climb mountains without overheating. It could run for hours on rough roads without rattling loose. In 1916, a Hudson Super 6 set a transcontinental record, driving from San Francisco to New York faster than any car before it. The same year, a Super 6 climbed Pikes Peak faster than anyone thought possible. The records were not publicity stunts. They were proof. The Super 6 could perform under conditions that destroyed lesser engines. The engine started at a modest power output, but would eventually reach 92 horsepower by the late 1920s. It wasn't the most powerful engine on the market. Packard and Pierce Arrow had larger engines with more displacement, but the Hudson was the smoothest. And in the world of middle-class buyers who wanted refinement without paying Cadillac prices, smooth was everything. The Super 6 made Hudson's reputation as an engineering company, but Chapin wasn't finished. In 1919, he launched a second brand called Essex. It was a budget line designed to compete directly with Ford and Chevrolet. The cars were simpler than Hudson's. The trim was plainer. The profit margins were thinner, but the volume was enormous. Essex offered buyers a way to own a six-cylinder car at a four-cylinder price. In 1922, Hudson introduced the Essex Coach, a closed-body sedan that cost only $300 more than an open touring car. This was the breakthrough. In 1922, most cars were still open vehicles. You sat exposed to rain, dust, and cold. A closed car was a luxury reserved for expensive models. But Hudson's subsidiary, Briggs Manufacturing, had developed a new construction technique that made closed bodies affordable. Within 3 years, demand was so strong that Hudson reduced the price until the closed and open models cost the same. It was the first time an affordable car came with weather protection as standard. Buyers abandoned open cars almost overnight. The entire industry followed Hudson's lead. By 1925, the combined sales of Hudson and Essex had pushed the company to third place in the United States, behind only Chevrolet and Ford. By 1929, Hudson Motor Car Company was manufacturing 300,000 vehicles a year. Roy Chapin was running an empire that its namesake had never lived to see flourish. Joseph Hudson had died on July 5, 1912, from a lung problem while on a business trip in Europe. The exact location of his death is disputed. Some sources say Worthing, England. Others say Paris. His body was returned to New York City aboard the ocean liner RMS Oceanic. From New York, Hudson's casket was carried to Detroit by train, accompanied by members of his family. Services were held on July 19, 1912, at Central Methodist Church before burial at Woodlawn Cemetery. He was 65 years old. He had been dead for 17 years by the time Hudson Motor Car Company reached its peak. He never saw the Super Six. He never saw Essex. He never saw the company reach third in national sales. He never saw his name become synonymous with quality engineering. His nephews, the four Weber brothers, ran the department store and expanded it into the massive structure that would dominate downtown Detroit. Hudson's name powered both empires, and the automotive empire was about to enter a long, dark valley. The stock market crashed in October 1929, and the automobile industry crashed with it. Sales collapsed across the board. Factories went dark. Workers were laid off by the thousands. Dealerships closed. The used car market was flooded with vehicles that desperate families sold to buy food. Hudson was not immune. Production dropped. Market share eroded. The company survived, but it was no longer growing. It was holding on. In 1932, the Essex brand was replaced by a new nameplate called Terraplane. The name referenced both terrain and airplane, suggesting a car that was fast and capable on any surface. The cars were smaller than Hudson's, lighter and quicker. They had a low price point. They became favorites of bank robbers and bootleggers who needed speed and reliability. John Dillinger, the notorious criminal, reportedly drove a Terraplane during his crime spree. The association with outlaws was not the marketing campaign Hudson had intended, but it proved the cars were quick. The company introduced innovations to stay competitive. In 1935, Hudson debuted the electric hand transmission, a semi-automatic system that used a button mounted on the dashboard to shift gears instead of a floor-mounted stick. It was revolutionary in concept. You pressed a button and the transmission shifted. But the execution was flawed. The mechanism was complex. It failed frequently. Customers hated it. Service departments dreaded it. The electric hand became notorious for operating incorrectly, or not at all. In 1936, the company introduced an independent front suspension system called the rhythmic ride. Unlike the electric hand, this innovation worked. It improved handling and ride quality. But these were incremental improvements. They were not game changers. They were the work of a company trying to remain relevant in a market that had fundamentally shifted. On February 7, 1933, workers at the Hudson Body Plant on Gratiot Avenue walked off the line. It was the company's first major strike. They demanded substantial wage increases. The Depression had driven wages down across Detroit. Workers who had earned good money in the 1920s were now struggling. The strike was sudden and angry. The vice president, Max Wohlering, agreed to meet with the workers. But he imposed a condition. The workers had to be Hudson employees and not be associated with communists. The fear of communist agitation was widespread in 1930s Detroit. Business leaders and government officials viewed labor organizing as a potential revolutionary threat. A representative from the U.S. Department of Labor, Robert Pilkington, publicly blamed the strike on the communist element. The accusation was typical of the era. Anyone demanding fair compensation was suspect. The main Jefferson Avenue assembly plant was reduced to half-day operation, while the body plant was idle. The strike lasted a week. Then the workers returned. They had gained nothing. Management had made no concessions. But the message was clear. The union movement was not going away. In 1937, After additional strikes and a sit-down protest at the body plant, Hudson officially recognized Local 154 of the United Auto Workers. The factory that had operated union-free for nearly 3 decades was now organized labor. The world was changing around Roy Chapin, and he was running out of time to adapt. In 1932, President Herbert Hoover appointed Chapin as Secretary of Commerce. It was an honor. Chapin was the first automobile executive to hold a cabinet position. He served from August 1932 to March 1933, during the final desperate months of Hoover's administration as the Depression deepened. Chapin's tenure was brief and largely ineffective. The economic collapse was beyond the reach of any single cabinet member. When Franklin Roosevelt took office in March 1933, Chapin returned to Detroit and resumed the presidency of Hudson. He was still fighting for better roads. He was still advocating for infrastructure investment as a way to stimulate the economy and expand the automobile market. He still believed that the automobile could transform America if only the roads were good enough to drive on. But his health was declining. The stress of the Depression years had worn him down. On February 16, 1936, Roy Dyckman Chapin played tennis with his friend Edsel Ford at the Detroit Athletic Club. It was winter. The weather was cold. Chapin caught a chill. Within days, the chill became a fever. The fever became pneumonia. In 1936, before antibiotics, pneumonia was often fatal. Chapin's condition deteriorated rapidly. He died at age 55. The man who had driven a curved dash Oldsmobile across 820 miles of dirt in 1901 to prove automobiles were viable, who had built Hudson into the third largest car company in America, who had believed that engineering mattered more than marketing, was gone. His funeral was attended by the leaders of Detroit's automobile industry. Henry Ford was there. The Dodge brothers' widows sent flowers. The governor of Michigan delivered a eulogy. Roy Chapin had been a giant, and Hudson Motor Car Company would never be the same. Leadership passed to A.E. Barrett. Barrett had started at Hudson in 1910 as a stenographer, taking dictation and filing correspondence. He had worked his way through every department in the company. He understood production, he understood sales, he understood finance, he knew the factory floor and the boardroom. Under Barrett's management, Hudson stabilized. The company turned a small profit in the late 1930s, but it could not regain the momentum of the 1920s. The market had changed. General Motors and Ford were pouring millions into annual styling updates. Chrome strips appeared and disappeared. Grills changed shape. Fenders became more swept. Customers expected their cars to look different every year. Chrysler was building sleek, modern cars with streamlined bodies that suggested speed even when standing still. The independent manufacturers like Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, and Packard were squeezed. They couldn't afford to redesign their cars every year. They couldn't match the Big Three's economies of scale in advertising, distribution, or production. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Hudson's Jefferson Avenue plant converted to military production. The conversion was total. Civilian car production ceased. The assembly lines that had built Hudsons and Terrapines now built components for the war effort. The factory produced 150,000 aircraft engines. It built wings for fighter planes. It built 9,000 pontoons for river crossings. It manufactured 352 air raid sirens that were installed in cities across the country. It produced 253 smokescreen generators. The work was essential. The contracts were lucrative. The war production kept Hudson Motor Car Company solvent. It kept workers employed when automobile sales had vanished, but it didn't build the future. While the assembly lines churned out military hardware, a small team of engineers and designers worked on a secret project in a corner of the engineering building. They called it Program 5. Program 5 was a plan for an entirely new kind of car, a vehicle so radical it would redefine what an automobile could be. The team was led by Frank Spring, the chief stylist, and included engineers like Millard Tancred and designers like Art Kibiger and Bob Andrews. They worked quietly during the war years. They sketched. They argued over proportions. They built small clay models. They studied European designs and American streamlining experiments. Their target was the 1942 Buick Sedanet, a fastback design that had been one of the last new models introduced before car production stopped. The Buick was sleek, it was modern. Hudson wanted to beat it. When the war ended in August 1945, the team accelerated. They knew that the post-war market would belong to whoever could get a genuinely new car to showrooms first. General Motors and Ford and Chrysler were all working on new designs. The race was on. Hudson's engineers refined Program 5. They tested structural concepts, they revised and iterated. They bet everything on the belief that American buyers wanted something revolutionary. In December 1947, Hudson invited the automotive press to the Masonic Temple in Detroit to see something they promised would change the automobile industry forever. They were right, and it would kill them. The curtain dropped at the Masonic Temple, and the room went silent. The car that sat on the stage looked like nothing else in America. It was low, impossibly low. The roofline seemed to float just inches above the ground. The body was smooth, uninterrupted by the fenders and running boards that defined every other car on the road. The wheels were partially enclosed by the body panels. The greenhouse, the glass area of the cabin, was large and airy. This was the 1948 Hudson. This was the step-down. The name referred to the way you entered the vehicle. You didn't step up onto a running board and climb in. You stepped down, over the frame rail, into a recessed floor. The innovation was in the structure itself. Most cars of the era were built with the passenger compartment sitting on top of the frame. The Hudson's floor was dropped between the frame rails. The frame encircled the passengers like a protective cage. The result was a car that sat 7 inches lower than a 1948 Buick. It had the lowest center of gravity of any American automobile. Passengers were surrounded by the car's frame structure, making it one of the safest cars ever built. In a collision, the frame absorbed the impact. The passenger sat inside the protective structure, not on top of it. The design also created interior space that defied the exterior dimensions. The front seats measured 61 3/4 inches wide. The rear seats measured 63 inches. The car utilized 82% of its total width for passenger room, the highest percentage in the industry. Most cars wasted space with thick door panels and bulky interior structures. The Hudson was efficient. The seats were wide and comfortable, described in marketing materials as armchair seating. You didn't perch, you sank into the Hudson. The engineering team was led by Frank Spring and Millard Tancred. Tancred, the chief engineer, called his design philosophy roadability. He was obsessed with ride quality, handling, and passenger comfort on the rough 2-lane roads of post-war America. There were no interstate highways yet. Americans drove on potholed state routes and gravel county roads. A car that handled well on perfect pavement was useless in the real world. The step-down Hudson was designed to absorb punishment and keep moving. The unit body construction, which Hudson called monobuilt, was massively overbuilt. Unlike traditional body-on-frame construction where the body and frame were separate pieces bolted together, the Hudson's body and frame were a single, welded structure. This made the car extremely stiff and rattle-free. The structure didn't flex, it didn't creak. It was nearly indestructible. The low center of gravity made the car handle like it was on rails. Competitors rolled and wallowed through corners. The Hudson stayed flat. When automotive journalist Tom McCahill tested the step-down for Mechanics Illustrated magazine, he was effusive. He called it the best road car in America by far. Production had started on October 12, 1947. The public debut was December 7th. The marketing slogan was simple and confident. Now you're face-to-face with tomorrow. In 1948, Hudson built 117,200 step-down models. They outsold expectations. They won praise from critics and customers. They proved that a mid-sized independent could beat Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler to market with a genuinely new design. The step-down Hudson was a masterpiece of engineering. It was also a cage, and within 6 years, it would become a tomb. The dirt ovals of the American South in 1951 were rough, rutted, and unforgiving. Stock car racing had evolved from bootleggers outrunning revenue agents on mountain roads to organized competitions on converted horse tracks. The tracks were often red clay or poorly maintained asphalt with minimal banking. Cars slid sideways through the turns. They crashed into each other and into the walls. They broke axles and threw rods and caught fire. Winning required more than horsepower. It required a car that could take punishment, hold a line through the corners, and keep accelerating when everything else was falling apart. The Hudson Hornet, introduced in 1951, was built for this kind of brutality. The Hornet featured a new engine, the H-145. It was a straight six-cylinder with 308 cubic inches of displacement, enormous for a six. Most six-cylinder engines were small and economical. The Hudson 6 was a monster. The standard version produced 145 horsepower. With the optional twin-H power setup, which added twin-Carter WA1 carburetors on a special dual-intake manifold, the engine produced 160 horsepower. For police and racing applications, Hudson offered the 7X package, a severe duty option developed by Vince Piggins. The 7X included heavy-duty valve springs, a hotter camshaft, and reinforced internal components. It could push output to 220 horsepower. The engine was based on a high chromium alloy block that was nearly indestructible. It could run hard for hours without overheating or failing. Combined with the step-down's low center of gravity and superior handling, the Hornet was a weapon on the track. NASCAR drivers noticed immediately. Marshall Teague campaigned a Hornet in 1951 and dominated the competition. Herb Thomas, Tim Flock, Frank Mundy, and Buck Baker followed. The cars were faster in the corners than anything Detroit was building. While Oldsmobiles and Chryslers had more horsepower in a straight line, they couldn't match the Hudson's grip through the turns. The step-down design's low center of gravity meant the car could enter corners at higher speeds and exit with better acceleration. On the rough dirt tracks where most cars bounced and slid, the Hudson stayed planted. In 1952, Hudson won the NASCAR Manufacturers' Championship. In 1953, they won again. In 1954, they completed the three-peat. Herb Thomas and his crew chief, a young mechanic named Smokey Unick, went on a tear in 1953 and 1954. Thomas was a talented driver from North Carolina who understood how to conserve his equipment and strike at the right moment. Unick was a mechanical genius who pushed the rules to the breaking point. Together, they won 24 of the 71 races they entered. Unick would become one of the most legendary figures in American motorsports, known for finding loopholes in the rulebook and extracting performance from engines that should have been impossible. The combination of Herb Thomas driving and Smokey Unick wrenching was unstoppable. Fans came to the tracks expecting to see the Hudson Hornet win. Other teams studied the Hudsons, trying to figure out how to beat them. Hudson launched a marketing campaign called Win on Sunday, Sell on Monday. The idea was simple and proven. If you dominate the racetrack on Sunday, customers will flock to the showroom on Monday to buy the same car. It had worked for other manufacturers. It didn't work for Hudson. Racing success had zero impact on sales. Customers didn't care that the Hornet was winning championships. They wanted V8 engines. They wanted fresh styling. They wanted chrome and tail fins, and cars that looked new every year. Hudson was winning every race and losing the war. By the end of 1954, Hudson had won its third straight NASCAR championship. The fabulous Hudson Hornets were legends, and the company had lost $10 million. The $10 million loss in 1953 was not an accident. It was the price of a catastrophic miscalculation. The step-down design, brilliant as it was, had a fatal flaw. The unit body construction was rigid and expensive to modify. Changing the exterior styling required re-engineering the entire structure. The floor pan, the frame rails, the door openings, the roof structure. Everything was integrated. You couldn't just stamp new fenders and call it a new model year. In the early 1950s, American car buyers expected annual styling changes. General Motors introduced new models every year. Taillights moved. Grills changed shape. Chrome trim appeared in new configurations. Ford refreshed its designs constantly. Chrysler debuted bold new looks that made last year's models look instantly dated. The independent manufacturers couldn't afford that pace. Hudson was stuck with the same basic step-down shape from 1948 to 1954. By 1952, the design looked dated. By 1954, it looked ancient. Customers walked into showrooms, saw the same car they had seen for 6 years, and walked out. Hudson's management faced a choice. They could spend millions redesigning the step-down, updating the styling while keeping the engineering advantages. Or they could gamble on something entirely new. They chose the gamble. In 1953, Hudson introduced the Jet, a compact car designed to compete with smaller European imports and appeal to budget-conscious American buyers. The company spent $12 million developing the Jet. It was a huge investment for a company Hudson's size. The Jet was tall and short and slab-sided. It had an upright greenhouse and awkward proportions. It looked like someone had taken a full-sized Hudson and compressed it vertically. The styling was conservative when the market wanted excitement. The car was underpowered. It felt cheap. Customers ignored it. Dealers couldn't give them away. In 1953, Hudson sold only 21,143 Jets. Total company production for the year, including the aging step-down models, was just 66,000 units. It was a disaster. The $12 million spent on the Jet could have redesigned the step-down. It could have developed a V8 engine. It could have saved the company. The timing could not have been worse. In 1953 and 1954, Henry Ford II and General Motors engaged in a brutal price war. Ford was trying to reclaim the #1 sales position from Chevrolet. Henry Ford II wanted to restore the company his grandfather had built to its former glory. Both companies flooded dealerships with cars and slashed prices. Ford forced dealers to take more inventory than they could sell, overstuffing dealer lots with cars that sat unsold. Chevrolet responded by ramping up production even higher and cutting prices further. Buyers could walk into a Ford or Chevrolet dealership and drive away in a brand new car for hundreds of dollars less than the sticker price. The strategy devastated the independent manufacturers. Hudson, Nash, Studebaker, and Packard couldn't compete with discounted Fords and Chevrolets built in factories that produced hundreds of thousands of units a year. Their sales collapsed, their inventories piled up, their cash reserves drained away. By late 1953, Hudson's board of directors could see the future clearly. The company could not survive alone. In 1952, Hudson had earned a profit of $8,300,000. In 1953, they lost $10,400,000. The Jet had failed. The step-down was obsolete. Racing championships were meaningless. And Korean War military contracts, which had kept the company afloat during the early sales slump, were ending as the war wound down. The company was bleeding cash. The options were simple: merge or die. A.E. Barrett, who had spent 43 years at Hudson rising from stenographer to president, picked up the phone and called George Mason. Mason was the president of Nash-Kelvinator, the company that built Nash and Rambler automobiles. Mason had approached Barrett twice before about a merger. Mason's vision was grand. He wanted to combine Nash, Hudson, Studebaker, and Packard into a single corporation that could compete with the Big Three. Barrett had said no both times. He believed Hudson could survive independently. He wasn't calling to say no anymore. Mason picked up on the second ring. He'd been waiting for this call for 3 years. The negotiations moved quickly. Both companies were in trouble. Both needed scale to survive. On January 14th, 1954, Nash-Kelvinator and Hudson Motor Car Company announced they would merge to form the American Motors Corporation. It was the largest corporate merger in United States history at the time. The combined company had $355 million in assets and more than $100 million in working capital. The deal involved over 30,000 employees and 58,000 stockholders. Thousands of Hudson and Nash dealers waited to learn what the merger would mean for their franchises. The merger was structured as a stock transfer. Hudson shareholders would receive 2 shares of American Motors stock plus 1 share of Nash-Kelvinator stock for every 3 shares of Hudson they held. It was presented as a merger of equals. It was not. Nash was larger. Nash was healthier. Nash's George Mason would run the combined company. A.E. Barrett was given a seat on the board of directors and a consulting role that was largely ceremonial. He had no real power. The deal was finalized on May 1st, 1954. George Mason became president and CEO of American Motors Corporation. His plan was ambitious. He immediately began negotiations with James Nance, the president of Packard, to bring Packard into the fold as well. The goal was to create a fourth major automobile manufacturer that could match General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler in scale and product range. Mason believed that only a combined Nash-Hudson-Studebaker-Packard entity could survive the brutality of the 1950s automobile market. Studebaker and Packard were in similar trouble to Hudson. Their sales were falling. Their costs were rising. Their products looked old. In July 1954, Studebaker and Packard merged separately to form the Studebaker-Packard Corporation. Mason hoped to bring them into American Motors as well, creating a super-independent that could finally compete. On October 8, 1954, 7 months after the Hudson-Nash merger was finalized, George Mason died. He was 63 years old. The cause was acute pancreatitis and pneumonia. His death was sudden and unexpected. He had been the architect of the merger. He had been the visionary who saw consolidation as the only path forward. Within 4 days, the board of directors elected George Romney, Mason's 47-year-old assistant and vice president, as president and chairman. Romney had been with Nash since the 1930s. He was a company man. He was also deeply religious and politically ambitious. He would later become governor of Michigan and run for president. Romney's first public statement as head of American Motors was clear and final. There are no mergers underway, either directly or indirectly. The Studebaker-Packard deal was dead. Romney had no interest in expanding. He wanted to consolidate. He wanted to focus on what worked, and what worked was the compact Rambler. The full-size Nash and Hudson models were bleeding money. Romney would kill them both. On October 29, 1954, the last Hudson built in Detroit rolled off the Jefferson Avenue assembly line. It was a Hornet. It was painted and inspected and driven to the storage lot. Production would continue for 3 more years. But they wouldn't be Hudsons. They would be Nashes wearing a Hudson badge. Kenosha, Wisconsin, 1955. The factory that had never built a Hudson was now building all of them. American Motors had moved all Hudson production to the former Nash plant in Kenosha. The decision was financial. The Nash plant had excess capacity. The Detroit plant was expensive to operate and maintain. Consolidation made sense on paper. It saved money. It streamlined operations. But it meant the death of Hudson as a distinct automobile. The Detroit workers lost their jobs. The Jefferson Avenue plant was converted to produce military components and then scheduled for demolition. And the cars that emerged from Kenosha wearing Hudson badges were not Hudsons. They were Nashes. The 1955 and 1956 Hudson Wasp was a rebadged Nash Statesman with a new grille and Hudson nameplates. The Hornet was a rebadged Nash Ambassador. The engineering was Nash. The chassis was Nash. The body stampings were Nash. The suspension geometry was Nash. Only the grille, the badges, and the nameplate were Hudson. Some of the cars received Packard V8 engines and Ultramatic transmissions, purchased from Studebaker-Packard as part of a parts-sharing agreement George Mason had negotiated before his death. The deal was supposed to benefit both companies. American Motors would get V8 engines without the cost of developing their own. Studebaker-Packard would get volume orders to keep their engine plant running. But the Packard engines were expensive. They were heavier than the Nash 6s. They were less reliable. The Ultramatic transmission was complex and failure-prone. By late 1956, American Motors introduced its own V8, a Nash-designed engine that replaced the troublesome Packard units. The rebadged Hudsons were expensive. A 1957 Hudson Hornet custom sedan had a base price of $3,011. A Chevrolet Bel Air, the most popular car in America, cost around $2,200. The Hornet cost $800 more than the Chevy and offered nothing the Chevrolet didn't, except a name that no longer meant anything. The styling was overwrought. The cars had excessive chrome and awkward proportions. They looked like what they were, desperate. Sales were dismal. Dealers were frustrated. They knew they were selling rebadged Nashes. Customers knew it too. The Hudson name, which had once stood for innovation and quality, now stood for corporate desperation. George Romney made a decision. American Motors would focus entirely on the compact Rambler line. The Rambler was selling well. It was profitable. It appealed to buyers who wanted fuel efficiency and practicality at a time when the Big Three were building larger and larger cars with bigger and bigger engines. The full-size Nash and Hudson models were bleeding money. They were relics of a dead strategy. Romney killed them both. On June 25, 1957, the last vehicle carrying the Hudson name left the assembly line in Kenosha, Wisconsin. It was a Hornet. It was inspected, titled, and shipped to a dealer. And with that, the Hudson Motor Car Company ceased to exist. 48 years, 8 founders, 1 department store fortune, 1 brilliant engineer, 1 revolutionary car, 1 catastrophic flaw. It was over. Within a year of the last Hudson, the Jefferson Avenue plant was scheduled for demolition. The process began in 1956 and continued through 1960. It took longer to tear down than it took to build. Albert Kahn had designed the factory with such robust construction that the concrete and steel refused to surrender easily. The demolition contractors arrived with wrecking balls and explosives. They attacked the walls. The concrete cracked but didn't crumble. The steel frames bent but didn't break. The contractors discovered that Kahn's reinforced concrete was thicker than standard construction. The rebar was denser. The footings went deeper than expected. Several demolition companies reportedly went bankrupt attempting to level the structure. The job dragged on for years. The rubble was hauled away in an endless stream of trucks. When the site was finally cleared in 1960, nothing remained but a flat expanse of dirt where tens of thousands of workers had built 300,000 cars a year at the company's peak. Today, the Jefferson Avenue site is occupied by the Stellantis Jefferson North Assembly Plant, where Jeep Grand Cherokees roll off the line in a modern factory that bears no resemblance to the Kahn masterpiece that once stood there. The original Aerocar building on Mack Avenue, the Ghost Factory where the first Hudson rolled out in July 1909, is still standing. It is over 110 years old. The faint white lettering that reads the Aerocar Company is still visible on the red brick exterior on the east side of the building. The structure is privately owned and not open to the public. But it remains a stubborn monument to the company that started in someone else's failure and became a legend. The step-down Hudsons, especially the Hornets, are highly collectible today. They appear at car shows and automotive museums across the country. Enthusiasts restore them to showroom condition, investing thousands of hours and tens of thousands of dollars to bring the cars back to their original glory. The cars that sold poorly in their final years are now treasured as examples of American engineering at its peak. A well-restored 1951 Hudson Hornet can sell for $50,000 or more. The NASCAR championships are remembered. The fabulous Hudson Hornets are legends in racing history. Herb Thomas and Smokey Yunick are honored in the NASCAR Hall of Fame. The championships they won in Hudsons are a permanent part of American motorsports heritage. In 2006, Pixar Animation Studios released a film called Cars. One of the main characters was Doc Hudson, a retired race car voiced by Paul Newman in one of his final roles. Doc was a Hudson Hornet who had dominated the Piston Cup in the 1950s before a crash ended his career and sent him into bitter retirement in a forgotten desert town. The character was a tribute to the real, fabulous Hudson Hornets. The film introduced the Hudson name to a generation of children who had never heard of the company. The irony is perfect. Hudson died in obscurity in 1957, largely forgotten by the American public. 50 years later, it was resurrected as a cartoon character and became more famous than it had been when the company existed. In recent years, Dodge revived the Hornet nameplate for a compact crossover SUV built on a Fiat platform. The modern Hornet has nothing to do with the original except the name, but the name survives. The factory is rubble. The step-down Hudsons are museum pieces. The company is extinct, but the lesson Hudson taught Detroit is still being learned. Generation after generation. Build the best, and you might build yourself into a corner. Hudson Motor Car Company was born from a contradiction. A man who didn't believe in automobiles funded a company that would prove automobiles could be perfect. Joseph Hudson repaid his creditors with compound interest and died 3 years after the company was founded, never seeing his name become synonymous with automotive innovation. Roy Chapin drove a curved-dash Oldsmobile 820 miles in 1901 to prove cars were viable transportation, then spent the rest of his life proving that innovation without adaptability could be fatal. The Super 6 engine was smooth when competitors were rough. The Essex closed-body coach was affordable when weather protection was expensive. The step-down design was safe when safety didn't sell. The Hornet won races when buyers wanted chrome and tail fins. Hudson's curse was that it was always solving the wrong problem. It built the lowest, safest, best-handling car in America in 1948. By 1954, no one wanted low or safe or handling. They wanted V8 engines and fresh sheet metal, and something that looked new every year. The unit body construction that made the step-down revolutionary also made it a prison. Changing the design required re-engineering everything. The cost was prohibitive. The timeline was impossible. The market moved faster than Hudson could follow. The independent automakers faced an impossible choice in the 1950s. Compete on engineering or compete on style. Compete on quality or compete on volume. Compete on innovation or compete on marketing. Hudson chose engineering. It chose quality, it chose innovation, and it died. Nash survived longer by choosing practicality and merging with a weaker partner it could dominate. Studebaker and Packard merged and still failed by 1966. Kaiser disappeared. Willys survived only by focusing on Jeeps and eventually being absorbed. By the end of the 1950s, only American Motors remained among the independents, and it survived by abandoning the full-size car market entirely and focusing on compacts. Romney's strategy of selling small, practical, fuel-efficient cars worked until the Big Three introduced their own compacts and crushed American Motors with superior marketing and distribution. The lesson is brutal and unavoidable. In the automobile industry, being medium-sized is fatal. You are either large enough to absorb losses and redesign annually, or you are small enough to occupy a niche that the giants ignore. Hudson was trapped in the middle. It was too big to be nimble and too small to compete with Detroit's giants on their terms. The step-down was the cage that brilliant engineering built. The low center of gravity that made it safe also made it expensive to change. The frame that protected passengers also imprisoned the designers. The engineering that won championships also guaranteed obsolescence. Every strength became a weakness when the market demanded constant reinvention. The original Aerocar building still stands at Mack Avenue and Beaufait, a brick reminder of where it all began. The Jefferson Avenue plant is gone, replaced by a modern Jeep factory that employs a fraction of the workers Hudson once did. Hudson's department store was demolished in 1998 after sitting vacant for 15 years. The implosion was the largest building demolition in history at the time. 20,000 people gathered in downtown Detroit to watch. At 5:47 p.m. on October 24, 1998, explosive charges fired in sequence. The tallest department store in the world collapsed into a 60-foot pile of rubble in less than 30 seconds. The dust cloud shrouded downtown Detroit for hours. The Hudson Weber Foundation, endowed by Joseph Hudson's nephews, continues to fund philanthropic work in Detroit. The name survives in charity. The step-down Hudsons survive in museums and private collections. The NASCAR championships survive in record books. And the fabulous Hudson Hornet survives in a Pixar movie, teaching children about a car company their grandparents forgot. The Hudson Motor Car Company built the safest, lowest, best-handling automobile in America in 1948. By 1954, no one wanted safe or low or handling. They wanted tail fins and V8 engines and something that looked new every year. Hudson built a cage strong enough to protect passengers from any crash except the one with the future. And when that crash came, there was no walking away.